Naomi Carter was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that settled in after 3 straight weeks of chasing leads across 4 states, tracking down every thread of a human trafficking ring. As she sank into her first-class seat, a rare indulgence after closing one of the biggest cases of her career, all she wanted was 6 uninterrupted hours of sleep on this red-eye from San Francisco to New Orleans. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Naomi looked up, meeting the gaze of a middle-aged white man in an expensive navy blue suit. His mouth was tight with disapproval, his stance radiating entitlement. She glanced at her boarding pass and then back at him. 15A. "This is my seat," she said, her voice calm despite her exhaustion. The man, later she would learn his name was Douglas Barrett, narrowed his eyes, scanning her from head to toe. His gaze lingered disapprovingly on her simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and natural curls pulled into a ponytail. "There must be some mistake," he said stiffly. "I always book first class on this route." What Naomi couldn't have known in that moment was that this seemingly routine seat dispute would ignite a series of events that would change multiple lives forever, unraveling hidden secrets, exposing the dark side of power and privilege, and testing her commitment to justice in ways her 15 years in the Bureau never had. Before the flight landed in New Orleans, blood would be spilled, alliances would shift, and the lives of several strangers on board would become tragically intertwined. And it all began with a seat assignment. "Sir, I can assure you, this is my seat," Naomi said, holding up her boarding pass. Douglas Barrett's face turned a deep red, the kind of flush that spread from the neck to the hairline, the mark of a man who wasn't used to being contradicted. Without another word, he snapped his fingers at a passing flight attendant, a young woman named Sophia Lynn, who had only been with the airline for 6 months. "Excuse me, there's a seating error," Douglas said, not even bothering to look at her. "This woman is in my seat." Sophia, ever professional, offered a polite, practiced smile. "I'd be happy to help. May I see both of your boarding passes?" Naomi handed hers over without hesitation. Douglas, on the other hand, made a dramatic show of checking every pocket of his suit jacket before finally producing his. 15B, Sophia read aloud, pointing to his ticket. "Sir, you're actually assigned to the seat next to this passenger. 15A is the window seat, and 15B is the aisle." Douglas's flush deepened. "That's impossible. I specifically requested a window seat. I always get a window seat." Sophia remained unfazed. "I understand your preference, sir, but according to our system, this is the correct assignment. I can check if there are any available window seats, but the flight is quite full tonight." Naomi sighed, rubbing her temple. All she wanted was to rest. The last thing she needed was to be seated next to a man who had already decided she didn't belong. "Is there a problem with me sitting here?" she asked, her voice firm, her gaze direct. Douglas sputtered. "I didn't say that, I just prefer the window. I'm a frequent flyer, platinum status." Sophia's smile didn't waver. "Let me check what I can do." She tapped on her tablet. "I'm afraid all first-class seats are occupied. There is, however, a window available in premium economy if you'd prefer to move." "Absolutely not." Douglas's voice rose sharply, drawing glances from the other passengers boarding. "I paid for first class, and that's what I expect to receive." "Then 15B is your assigned seat, sir," Sophia said, her tone final. "Would you like any assistance with your carry-on?" Grumbling under his breath, Douglas stowed his designer luggage, then dropped into his seat with visible irritation. He took out a sanitizing wipe and dramatically cleaned the armrest between them. Naomi ignored him, opening her book, a biography of Henrietta Lacks, a story of struggle and resilience she had been meaning to finish for months. The case that had consumed her life for weeks was finally over. Diego Morales was in custody. 38 women and girls were safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. That's quite a heavy choice for in-flight reading. Naomi blinked, momentarily surprised that Douglas had chosen to speak to her at all. "Pardon? The book." He gestured toward it with a dismissive nod. "Wouldn't you prefer something lighter? A romance novel, perhaps?" The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Naomi had encountered enough men like Douglas in her life to recognize the type, the ones who wore their privilege like an invisible crown and expected the world to bow accordingly. I find inspiration in stories of people who overcome systemic barriers, she replied evenly, especially women who refuse to be defined by others' expectations. Douglas shifted uncomfortably as if he hadn't expected pushback. Well, we all have our interests, I suppose. The plane finished boarding, and Sophia moved to the front to begin the safety demonstration. As Naomi glanced at Douglas, she noticed the way his gaze lingered on Sophia Lynn, tracking her movements with a level of intensity that made her investigator instincts prickle. "Frequent flyer?" Naomi asked casually. Douglas straightened, pleased at the chance to boast. "Every week for the past 20 years. "That must be exhausting," Naomi said. He smirked. "Worth it for the lifestyle it provides. My wife never has to worry about a thing." His gaze flicked to the simple gold band on Naomi's hand. "What about your husband? What does he do?" "I'm not married," Naomi said, absent-mindedly twisting the ring. "It was my grandmother's. She raised me after my parents passed." Douglas's expression flickered with something. Maybe sympathy, maybe something else. But just as quickly his cool, assessing demeanor returned. "I see." He paused, then asked, "What brings you to New Orleans? Visiting family?" "Work," Naomi replied simply, not elaborating. Years in the bureau had taught her the value of discretion, especially around strangers who had already revealed their prejudices. "What line of work?" Douglas pressed. "If you don't mind me asking." Naomi met his gaze and smiled slightly. "Education." For now, she would let him believe that. Naomi was about to respond to Douglas's condescending remark when a sudden commotion a few rows behind them stole her attention. "I refuse to sit next to him. This is completely unacceptable." She turned to see an elderly white woman, impeccably dressed in a beige pantsuit, pointing an accusatory finger at a young Middle Eastern man who was quietly placing his carry-on in the overhead bin. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," said one of the flight attendants, Ethan Reyes, his badge flashing under the dim cabin lights. The woman's voice dropped, but her words were just as venomous. "Do you know what his people have done to this country?" A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Naomi felt her stomach clench. The young man, clearly humiliated, stared at the floor. "I was born in Illinois," he said softly. "I'm a medical student." Douglas leaned toward Naomi and murmured, "This is exactly why I drive whenever possible. Air travel just isn't what it used to be." Naomi turned sharply to face him, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" Douglas, oblivious to the growing edge in her voice, sighed dramatically. "Standards have dropped. Used to be a time when flying was refined. Now, with all these budget airlines, it's just a free-for-all. Anyone can board." Naomi's jaw clenched. "Anyone?" she repeated slowly. Before Douglas could backtrack, Sophia Lynn approached the scene behind them, addressing the irate woman. "Ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, I can check if there are any alternate seating options available," she said diplomatically. "However, I assure you, all of our passengers have gone through security screenings." "I don't care about your screenings," the woman snapped. "I know exactly what I see." The young man, looking barely older than 20, cleared his throat. "If it helps, I don't mind switching seats." Naomi, before even realizing what she was doing, was already unfastening her seatbelt. "I'll switch," she called out. Douglas's head snapped toward her. "You're leaving?" Naomi gave him a cool glance. "It seems my presence has made you just as uncomfortable as hers has. So yes, I'll offer my seat to this young man. You can have your precious window view after all." She gathered her book and carry-on. As she moved past Douglas, he briefly caught her wrist, a presumptuous touch that sent a surge of irritation through her. "I never said I had a problem with you," he said, looking genuinely confused. Naomi smoothly removed his hand with a firm grip, one that made his eyes widen slightly. "You didn't have to say it." As she reached the back of first class, Ethan was still attempting to calm the elderly woman. Naomi recognized the name on her conference badge, Vivian Caldwell, likely an executive or corporate figure of some sort. "I'd be happy to take his seat," Naomi told Ethan. "I was in 15A. The young man turned to her, gratitude in his eyes. "You really don't have to do that." Naomi offered a reassuring nod. "It's no trouble at all." "I'm Zayn Malik," he said, extending his hand. "Naomi Carter," she replied as they made the switch. As Zayn settled into first class, Vivian Caldwell continued muttering under her breath. Naomi took the seat beside her, fastening her seatbelt. They should have warned me, Vivian said as soon as Zane was out of earshot. I'm a nervous flyer as it is, and to be seated next to, well, you understand. Naomi turned her head slowly. Actually, I don't. Vivian blinked rapidly, caught off guard. Oh, come now, dear. You can't tell me you didn't feel the same. Naomi leaned in slightly. I'd like you to be very clear about what you're implying, Miss Caldwell, because from where I sit, it sounds like you're making assumptions based purely on someone's appearance. And that's a dangerous way to think. Vivian's mouth opened and closed, her lips moving without sound, like a fish gasping for air. Who do you think you are to speak to me like this? I'm 73 years old. Naomi offered a small, polite smile. Age doesn't exempt anyone from basic decency, or from the consequences of their actions. The plane began taxiing, forcing a pause in their conversation. From her seat, Naomi could see Douglas now comfortably settled in first class, his coveted window seat finally his. But his attention wasn't on the view. He kept glancing back toward Coach, his expression unreadable. Little did he know, the real chaos was still to come. 2 hours into the flight, most passengers had settled into the quiet rhythms of overnight travel. The cabin lights were dimmed, and the steady hum of the engines provided a low, lulling backdrop for those trying to sleep. Naomi had managed to doze off, despite the occasional disapproving glance from Vivian. She woke to the sound of hushed urgency. Sir, can you hear me? Ethan Rise was kneeling over an elderly man 3 rows ahead, shaking his shoulder gently, his face full of concern. Naomi's instincts kicked in. Unfastening her seatbelt, she quickly moved toward them. Is everything okay? She asked in a low voice. Ethan glanced up, relieved to see her. He was complaining of chest pain earlier. Now he's unresponsive. I'm a doctor, came a voice from behind them. Naomi turned to see Zayn Malik moving swiftly from first class. May I? Ethan stepped aside as Zayn crouched beside the man, checking his pulse and pupils. We need to lay him flat, Zayn instructed. Does the plane have a medical kit and an AED? Yes. I'll grab them now, Ethan said, hurrying toward the front. Naomi knelt beside the unconscious man. Sir, can you hear me? His eyelids flickered for a brief moment, but then his head lolled to the side. His skin had taken on a grayish hue. Zayn's jaw tightened. I think he's having a heart attack. We need to move him to the aisle, Zayn instructed, his voice steady despite the urgency in his expression. Naomi helped lower the elderly man from his seat onto the narrow aisle floor as carefully as possible. He was in his 70s, his breathing shallow and uneven. Passengers were now fully awake, craning their necks to watch. Does anyone know this man? Naomi asked, scanning the concerned faces around her. A woman across the aisle hesitated before speaking. His name is Henry Lawson. He told me earlier he was flying to New Orleans for his granddaughter's wedding. Ethan Rise returned quickly with the medical kit and AED, his usually calm demeanor now tinged with concern. Zayn's earlier nervousness vanished, replaced by a sharp focus as he unbuttoned Henry's shirt. I'm applying the AED pads, Naomi said, already peeling them from their protective backing. As they worked, Naomi became aware of someone standing at the edge of first class, observing them intently. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Douglas Barrett. Can I help you with something, sir? Naomi asked, keeping her eyes on the AED as she placed the sensors on Henry's chest. Douglas didn't move closer, but his voice was tight, almost strained. I know that man, he said. Naomi glanced up sharply, catching something unreadable in his expression. You know him? She repeated. Douglas hesitated for just a fraction too long before responding. Business associate. Is he going to be all right? Zayn answered without looking up. We're doing everything we can. Naomi narrowed her eyes at Douglas. You said business associate. Are you a friend? Do you know if he has any medical conditions? Douglas shook his head a little too quickly. No, not a friend. Just business. Without another word, he abruptly turned and walked back to his seat. Naomi's instincts prickled. Something about his reaction felt off. Sophia Lynn approached with urgent news. The captain is requesting any medical personnel on board to identify themselves, she announced. We also need to determine whether an emergency landing is necessary. Zayn spoke up immediately. I'm a second-year medical student, and in my professional opinion, this passenger is experiencing a cardiac event, he said. He needs hospital care as soon as possible. I strongly recommend diverting to the nearest airport. Sophia gave a quick nod and hurried back to the cockpit. Naomi turned her gaze to the front of the cabin. Vivian Caldwell, the same woman who had earlier been so openly prejudiced toward Zane, was now watching him work with rapt attention. Funny how people's biases vanished when their lives, or the lives of people like them, were on the line. Naomi murmured under her breath, "Hypocrites." No one heard her. The next 30 minutes were tense, as the pilot changed course toward Memphis, where medical personnel would be waiting. Henry Lawson's condition stabilized slightly, thanks to Zane's quick thinking, but he remained unconscious. Naomi, however, wasn't watching Henry anymore. She was watching Douglas Barrett. Throughout the remainder of the flight, he kept glancing back toward the coach section, an uneasy tension growing in his posture. What was he so worried about? The moment the plane landed in Memphis, paramedics boarded, quickly taking over Henry's care. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, his eyes suddenly fluttered open, glassy with medication, but desperate to speak. His hand shot out, grabbing the paramedic's arm with surprising strength. "Douglas," he gasped, his voice hoarse but urgent. Naomi's attention snapped to first class, where Douglas had suddenly buried his face in his laptop screen. "Sir, please stay calm." One of the paramedics soothed. "We're taking you to the hospital." But Henry shook his head, panic setting in. "No, you don't understand. He's trying to." His voice cut off abruptly as the medication in his IV finally pulled him into unconsciousness. The paramedics quickly wheeled him off the plane. Passengers whispered among themselves, speculation spreading like wildfire. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to our emergency landing, we will have a delay of approximately 2 hours while we refuel and complete the necessary paperwork. You are welcome to deplane and use the terminal facilities, but please do not leave the gate area." As passengers gathered their belongings, Naomi quietly approached Zane, who was repacking the medical kit. "That was impressive work," she said. Zane shrugged modestly, though Naomi could tell he was pleased. "Just doing what I'm trained for," he said, though usually with a lot more supervision. Before Naomi could say anything else, an unexpected voice spoke up. "I misjudged you," Vivian Caldwell said hesitantly, standing a few feet away. "That was very skillful." Naomi raised an eyebrow at the older woman's sudden shift in attitude, but Zane simply nodded politely. "Anyone would have done the same," he said. Vivian looked down, her expression conflicted. "No," she admitted quietly. "Not everyone." As passengers filed off the plane, Naomi saw Douglas Barrett slip away, heading toward a quiet corner of the terminal, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. Her investigator's instincts were screaming. She followed him at a distance, careful not to attract attention. Douglas stopped near a closed coffee shop, lowering his voice. "It's complicated." Naomi pretended to check her phone, positioning herself just close enough to hear. "Lawson was taken to the hospital." A pause. "No, he didn't say anything. Not anything specific, but he recognized me." Naomi's pulse quickened. Douglas listened, nodding slightly before responding. "The shipment is still on schedule for tomorrow night. Everything's in place at the New Orleans warehouse. I've been running this route for 5 years without issue. This is a minor setback." His voice tightened. "Yes, I understand. I'll handle it." Naomi took a slow step back, processing what she had just heard. Medical equipment sales, warehouses, shipments. None of it directly incriminating, but when paired with Henry's reaction, Douglas's visible anxiety, and the cryptic nature of his call, something was wrong. Very wrong. Naomi pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to her FBI colleagues in New Orleans. "Need background check. Douglas Barrett. Medical equipment sales. Possible connection to Case 47B. Also, Henry Lawson, currently being transported to a Memphis hospital. Urgent." She hit send. Whatever was happening, this wasn't just a routine business trip for Douglas Barrett, and Naomi was going to find out exactly what he was hiding. Naomi's phone buzzed in her hand almost as soon as she sent the request for information on Douglas Barrett and Henry Lawson. Barrett has surfaced in peripheral investigations on black market pharmaceuticals. No direct evidence? Yet. Lawson, unknown. Keep distance, observe only. Local agents en route to hospital. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. What had begun as a simple seat dispute was now spiraling into something far more intricate. The human trafficking case she had just closed, was it truly over? or had she unknowingly brushed up against something bigger? As the passengers began reboarding the plane, Naomi's attention was drawn to Sophia Lynn and Ethan Reyes near the gate desk. Sophia was visibly upset, discreetly wiping at her eyes, while Ethan offered a few quiet words of reassurance. Naomi approached, lowering her voice. "Everything okay?" Sophia straightened immediately, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh yes, thank you for asking. Just a personal matter." "You sure?" Naomi pressed gently. "That was a stressful situation with the medical emergency. It's normal to feel shaken." Sophia hesitated. "It's not that." Naomi caught the flicker of discomfort in her expression. "Then what is it?" Sophia sighed, glancing around before lowering her voice. "It's just... one of the passengers has been making me uncomfortable all flight." Naomi's stomach tightened. "Would that passenger happen to be seated in first class?" Sophia's eyes widened slightly. "How did you know?" Naomi crossed her arms. "Douglas Barrett has a way of making his presence felt." Sophia bit her lip, then shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle. This kind of thing happens in my job. But Ethan thought I should report it to the captain." Naomi's voice hardened. "And you absolutely should." Sophia sighed again, her shoulders tense. "It's complicated. He's a platinum member, flies this route all the time. Customer satisfaction affects our performance reviews." The familiar frustration rose in Naomi's chest. How many times had she heard victims explain why they didn't report powerful men? How many times had institutions protected predators instead of those they harmed? Naomi made a decision. "I don't usually do this during an investigation, but I think you should know who you're dealing with." She reached into her pocket, flashing her badge just enough for Sophia to see. "I'm Special Agent Naomi Carter, FBI. And if you're willing to make a formal statement about Mr. Barrett's behavior, I can make sure it's taken seriously." Sophia's eyes widened further. "FBI? Are you investigating him?" Naomi kept her expression neutral. "I can't comment on that, but I can tell you that any details about his behavior, on or off this flight, could be relevant." Ethan looked between them. "Wait, this is about Henry Lawson, isn't it? That medical emergency? Was that not natural?" Naomi chose her words carefully. "I'm not saying that," she said, "but I am very interested in any unusual behavior you may have noticed about Mr. Barrett, particularly any interactions he had with Mr. Lawson." Sophia and Ethan exchanged glances. "Actually," Sophia said slowly, "there was something strange before boarding." Naomi leaned in. "I saw Mr. Barrett and Mr. Lawson having what looked like an argument in the terminal," Sophia explained. "They clearly knew each other, but once they boarded they didn't sit together. They didn't even acknowledge one another." Ethan nodded in agreement. "And after we assigned seats," he added, "Barrett specifically asked if Mr. Lawson had checked any luggage and what his final destination was." The pieces were falling into place in Naomi's mind. She pulled a card from her pocket. "If you notice anything else, let me know, and whatever you do, don't confront him." As Naomi stepped back onto the plane, she made a choice. She returned to her original seat in first class. The medical emergency had required a new passenger manifest, and in the shuffle, she used the confusion to her advantage. Douglas looked up in surprise as she slid into 15A. "I thought you'd switched seats permanently," he said. Naomi smiled. "Change of plans. The gentleman needed to be near the lavatory after the emergency." Douglas shifted uncomfortably. After a pause, he cleared his throat. "About earlier, I feel I may have given you the wrong impression." Naomi tilted her head. "Oh?" Douglas gave her a tight smile. "I'm not a racist." Naomi didn't bother to hold back a smirk. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "You have black friends, maybe even voted for Obama once?" Douglas's face flushed red. "That's unfair. You don't know anything about me." Naomi's eyes darkened. "I know more than you think, Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "For instance, I know you recognized Henry Lawson, but pretended not to know him well." Douglas's shoulders stiffened. "I know you made a very tense phone call in the terminal about a shipment arriving at a warehouse in New Orleans tomorrow night." His grip tightened on his armrest. "And I know you've been making the flight attendant uncomfortable with unwanted attention." The color drained from Douglas's face. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed. Naomi simply smiled and opened her book again. "Just another passenger," she said lightly. "Try and get to New Orleans." She let the words settle before delivering the final blow. Although I'd suggest you think carefully about your next moves, she added, turning a page. Authorities in Memphis are already speaking with Mr. Lawson. It was a bluff. She had no idea whether Henry was even conscious, let alone talking to investigators. But Douglas's reaction told her everything she needed to know. You're making a serious mistake, he whispered, his earlier pretense of civility completely gone. Naomi smirked. I could say the same to you. She turned the page in her book, pretending to be unbothered. But in reality, her instincts were on high alert, because Douglas Barrett was more than just an arrogant businessman. He was hiding something. And whatever it was dangerous. For the rest of the flight, Naomi and Douglas sat in tense silence. He made several trips to the lavatory, each time returning more agitated than before. Naomi observed the subtle but telling change. He had switched from drinking scotch to water, a man trying to clear his head before landing. Whatever was waiting for him in New Orleans, he wanted to be sharp for it. As the plane began its descent, Naomi's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the New Orleans field office. Warehouse identified, surveillance in place, strike team on standby, confirm status upon landing. She quickly texted back, subject on board, unaware of investigation, will delay at baggage claim. What Naomi didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Douglas wasn't the only passenger on this flight involved in the conspiracy. As the wheels touched down on the New Orleans runway, Vivian Caldwell made a call of her own. Her previous bigotry toward Zion was nothing more than one facet of a deeply corrupted character. I'm here, she murmured into her phone, but there's a complication. I think Douglas is under surveillance. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness of the New Orleans morning, a black SUV idled near the passenger pickup zone. Inside, a man listened to instructions through an earpiece. Understood. We'll handle the FBI agent. Proceed with extraction as planned. The pieces were moving. Naomi had followed her instincts onto this flight, not realizing she had just walked into a trap that had been months in the making. As she stepped off the plane and into the airport jetway, the true scale of the conspiracy was about to reveal itself. Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport hummed with early morning activity as passengers from Flight 227 streamed into the terminal. Naomi kept Douglas in her sights as he hurried toward baggage claim. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by barely concealed panic. She let several travelers pass between them, keeping a comfortable distance, while her hand instinctively brushed against her concealed service weapon beneath her hoodie. 15 years in the field had made the weight of it familiar, a silent reassurance as she scanned her surroundings for potential threats. Her phone vibrated again. Strike team in position at north and south exits. Confirm, subject visual. Naomi quickly typed back. Visual confirmed. Subject proceeding to baggage claim. Will update on movement. The escalator carried them down into the sprawling main concourse, already filling with morning travelers. A few steps ahead, Naomi spotted Zayn Malik, his backpack slung over one shoulder as he checked his phone. Their eyes met briefly, and she offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Then everything erupted into chaos. It was a coordinated ambush. First, a coffee cart overturned near the base of the escalator, sending cups, napkins, and scalding liquid flying. Passengers shouted in alarm, instinctively scattering, creating the perfect barrier between Naomi and Douglas. At that same moment, a group of men in TSA uniforms approached Douglas from the side. Before Naomi could react, they swiftly guided him through a staff-only door. It was done so smoothly that to an untrained eye, it looked like a routine security escort. But Naomi wasn't fooled. She pushed forward against the tide of confused passengers, yanking her badge from her hoodie. "Federal agent," she shouted. "Stop!" But the door had already slammed shut. Naomi reached for the handle, locked. Cursing under her breath, she whipped out her phone and spoke urgently into it. Subject being extracted by individuals posing as TSA, East Concourse, service door near gate C12. In pursuit. Need backup now. Then another realization struck her. Through the chaos of the alarm blaring overhead, Naomi caught sight of Vivian Caldwell moving against the flow of passengers, speaking quietly into what looked like a discreet communication device disguised as a hearing aid. It wasn't just Douglas being extracted. Vivian was part of this too. "Stop that woman," Naomi called out, pointing directly at her. but her voice was lost in the cacophony of alarms and panicked travelers. Naomi had to make a choice: pursue Douglas or seize the one loose thread she could still reach. She changed course. Shoving through the crowd, she sprinted toward Vivian, who was now moving with a surprising swiftness for her age. "FBI! Freeze!" Naomi shouted, closing the distance. Vivian turned sharply, her eyes widening at the sight of Naomi's badge and weapon. For a brief moment, she hesitated, then her hand darted into her purse. Naomi's training kicked in. She lunged forward, tackling Vivian to the ground before she could pull out whatever she was reaching for. A small firearm clattered across the floor. A silencer attached. Not standard equipment for someone supposedly attending a pharmaceutical conference. Vivian hissed through her teeth as Naomi secured her hands behind her back. "You're making a terrible mistake," she spat. "Do you have any idea who I work for?" Naomi leaned down, voice low and unshaken. "At the moment, you're working on a federal obstruction charge." Airport security finally arrived, weapons drawn. Naomi flashed her badge again. "Special Agent Naomi Carter, FBI. This woman is under arrest in connection with a federal investigation. I need this area secured and immediate access to your security center." The lead officer, a tough-looking man named Rodriguez, assessed the scene quickly, then gave a firm nod. "Understood. Johnson, escort Special Agent Carter and the suspect to the security office. I'll radio ahead." As Naomi and Rodriguez moved through the terminal with Vivian in custody, she caught Zane's concerned gaze from near a coffee shop. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, silently acknowledging his earlier help with Henry Lawson. Little did she know, their paths were about to cross again, under even more dangerous circumstances. Naomi stood behind Rodriguez in the airport security office, watching the surveillance footage play on multiple screens. "Pull up all footage from the East Concourse near Gate C12, starting 5 minutes ago," she instructed. "And I need access to your service corridor maps." Rodriguez nodded, quickly pulling up the video feeds. As the footage rolled, Naomi watched Douglas Barrett's extraction unfold from multiple angles. The men who had taken him were smooth, efficient, and organized. Their movements practiced, their timing flawless. Not TSA. The uniforms were close but not exact. A detail that only someone familiar with airport operations would notice. "Freeze that frame." Rodriguez paused the footage, and Naomi leaned in, pointing at a man turning toward the camera. "Enhance that." Rodriguez adjusted the controls, bringing the image into sharper focus. Naomi's blood ran cold. Colin Drake, former Special Forces, now the head of security for Langford Global, one of the most powerful private corporations in New Orleans. Her jaw tightened. She turned toward Vivian Caldwell, still restrained in a chair, watching the footage with a smug expression. "I need to make a call." Vivian tilted her head. "Too late, Agent Carter. The shipment is already being moved. Your little operation? Blown to pieces." Naomi ignored her, dialing her supervisor. "Sir, we have a situation. The Morales case has opened into something much bigger. I believe Langford Global is involved in the trafficking network." A pause. Then Deputy Director Samuel Briggs's voice came through, too calm, too immediate. "Carter, stand down." Naomi's grip tightened on her phone. "Sir, with all due respect, I've been tracking this network for months. If Langford Global is involved..." "That's exactly why you need to step back." Briggs cut her off sharply. "Langford has connections throughout the Bureau. We need to approach this carefully." Naomi lowered her voice, stepping further from Vivian. "Sir, they abducted a suspect from the terminal. They have armed operatives posing as TSA. This isn't a time for caution, they're cleaning house." Another pause. Then finally, "Where are you now?" "Airport security office. One suspect in custody." "Stay there. I'm sending a team from the New Orleans field office. Do not engage further." The line went dead. Naomi stared at her phone, an uneasy feeling creeping in. Briggs's response had been too measured, too immediate. Almost like he had been expecting her call. Her instincts were screaming. She turned back to Rodriguez. "We need to move this suspect, now." Rodriguez barely had time to nod before the security office door burst open. 4 men entered, suits, professional, confident. The lead one flashed an FBI badge. "Special Agent Carter, I'm Agent Brooks from the New Orleans field office. We're here to take custody of your suspect." Naomi's pulse spiked. She didn't recognize any of them. Rodriguez didn't move. Naomi kept her voice even. I wasn't expecting you so quickly. May I see your credentials again? As Brooks reached for his badge, Naomi noticed the slight shift of his jacket. And she saw it. A foreign-made compact submachine gun with a suppressor. Not FBI issue. Everything clicked into place in an instant. The corruption wasn't just in the trafficking network. It had infiltrated the bureau itself. Naomi drew her weapon in one fluid motion. Gun! Down! Now! The room erupted into chaos. Rodriguez dived for cover as Naomi fired 2 rapid shots, one hitting Brooks in the shoulder, the other catching another fake agent in the leg. The remaining 2 opened fire, their suppressors muffling the blasts as bullets tore into the walls. Naomi rolled behind a desk, grabbing Vivian and using her as a shield. Tell them to stand down, she barked. Vivian's expression was eerily calm. You're dead, Agent Carter, she murmured. You just don't know it yet. One of the fake agents moved toward the door, likely to prevent outside intervention. Naomi took the shot, hitting him in the side and sending him sprawling. Rodriguez had recovered his weapon, firing at the 4th assailant, who ducked behind a filing cabinet. Security breach in the main office, Rodriguez shouted into his radio. Shots fired, multiple officers down. Naomi knew that by the time real reinforcements arrived, these men would have eliminated her and extracted Vivian. She needed to change the dynamic. Now, listen to me, she said to Rodriguez. These aren't FBI. They're here to kill us and take Caldwell. We need to move. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Service tunnel behind that cabinet leads to the tarmac. Cover me. As Rodriguez laid down suppressing fire, Naomi dragged Vivian toward the hidden exit, pushing the filing cabinet aside to reveal a maintenance door. They slipped through just as a fresh volley of bullets splintered the wood behind them. Rodriguez, come on, Naomi shouted. Go, I'll hold them off. Rodriguez reloaded his weapon, turning back to face the enemy alone. Naomi had seconds to act. The maintenance tunnel was dimly lit and narrow, forcing them to move in single file. She pushed Vivian ahead, gun trained on her back. Who are you really working for? Naomi demanded. Don't say Langford Global. You're too connected for that. Vivian laughed softly. You really have no idea, do you? Naomi shoved her forward. Try me. Vivian smirked. Why do you think Henry Lawson was so eager to talk? He's been trying to escape for months, but they don't let people just walk away. Who is they? Before Vivian could answer, the tunnel ahead flooded with light. Naomi yanked her back into an alcove, clamping a hand over her mouth. 2 maintenance workers walked past, chatting about a broken luggage conveyor. As soon as they passed, Naomi pushed forward again. You're not getting out of this airport. Vivian sneered. Every exit is being watched. Naomi gritted her teeth. Then I'll make my own. No signal, no backup. She was on her own, and the only way out was through. The baggage tunnel opened into a vast labyrinth of conveyor belts, scanning stations, and automated sorting mechanisms. The noise was deafening, thousands of bags moving like blood cells through arteries, the hum of machinery creating a constant mechanical roar. Naomi shoved Vivian forward. Where are you taking me? The older woman shouted over the noise. Naomi kept her voice steady. Somewhere we can talk, without interruptions. She kept to the shadows, maneuvering through the blind spots of security cameras, weaving through the mechanical maze. Finally, she spotted a small control room overlooking the main sorting area. She pushed Vivian inside, locking the door behind them. Through the glass windows they could see the endless flow of luggage, but from the outside, no one could see them. Naomi gestured to a chair with her weapon. Sit. Vivian complied, her earlier smugness replaced by careful calculation. What now, Agent Carter? She asked, tilting her head. Your career is over. By now, you've been flagged as a rogue agent. Every law enforcement officer in this airport is looking for you. Naomi kept her expression neutral. That works both ways, she said. If I'm already a fugitive, that means I have nothing to lose. So if you don't start talking, Vivian, I might decide you're more useful as a body than as a witness. It was a bluff, but Vivian didn't need to know that. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Naomi leaned in. 3 weeks tracking human traffickers, she said, her voice dangerously soft. 38 victims who will never be the same. And now I find out it goes deeper than Morales, straight into the very agencies meant to protect those victims. Try me. Something in her tone convinced Vivian that she was serious. The older woman sighed, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. All right, she admitted. But understand this. What I tell you won't save you. It will only confirm why you need to be eliminated. Naomi shrugged. I'll take my chances. Vivian folded her hands in her lap, her voice smooth and steady. It's called the Crescent Group, she began. On paper, it's a civic improvement initiative funded by the city's most powerful businesses and philanthropists. In reality, she smiled coldly, it's a clearinghouse for everything from human trafficking to black market pharmaceuticals to weapons smuggling. Naomi's mind raced. Langford Global. The fake FBI agents. The abduction of Henry Lawson. It was all connected. And Langford Global? Naomi pressed. Vivian chuckled softly. They're just the visible face. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. The real power lies with a group called the Syndicate. 7 individuals who control everything from judicial appointments to federal contract allocations. Naomi's breath caught. She had spent years chasing ghosts. Leads that mysteriously stalled, cases reassigned, suspects disappearing overnight. This was why. She gripped her gun tighter. And Douglas Barrett? Vivian tilted her head. Logistics, she said simply. His medical equipment company provides the perfect cover for moving product across state lines. FDA-approved containers, legitimate shipping manifests. The pharmaceuticals? Just a bonus. Naomi exhaled sharply. Everything fit too perfectly. And Henry Lawson? Vivian's smirk faded slightly. Former syndicate member. Naomi's pulse spiked. Lawson was part of this? Until his granddaughter was nearly caught in one of Morales' recruitment rings, Vivian said. That's when he got cold feet. Started making noise about exposing everything. The syndicate doesn't tolerate liabilities. Naomi's stomach turned. That explained why her trafficking investigation had been so carefully contained, why certain leads had been shut down without explanation, and why Douglas Barrett and Langford Global were so desperate to keep Henry silent. She narrowed her eyes. And you, where do you fit in? Vivian smiled, cold and knowing. I vet the talent. I find the vulnerable ones, the ones who can be turned. Naomi's blood ran cold. Vivian's eyes gleamed with something almost triumphant. Like your deputy director Briggs. Naomi felt like she had been punched in the gut. Briggs had been her mentor for years. You're lying. Vivian raised an eyebrow. Am I? She leaned forward. Who sent you on that wild goose chase after Morales while the real operation continued unimpeded? Who made sure you never looked too closely at the New Orleans connection? Naomi's chest tightened. The signs had been there all along. The cases that were reassigned, the leads that suddenly went cold. She had trusted Briggs, and now she realized. He had been protecting them all along. Before Naomi could respond, her phone buzzed. Somehow, she had signal again. A text message appeared. Maintenance room 3C. 5 minutes. Come alone. Naomi's eyes narrowed. How did Zayn Malik have her number? She turned back to Vivian. Stand up. The older woman smirked. Moving already? We're going to meet someone who might be very interested in what you've just told me. Navigating through the baggage system's maze was a challenge, but Naomi managed to reach Maintenance Room 3C, a small workshop filled with tools and spare conveyor parts. She pushed Vivian inside, securing her to a pipe with a zip tie. Don't make a sound. The door opened quietly. Zayn stepped inside, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, limping but very much alive, Henry Lawson. Naomi whipped her gun up instinctively. Henry held up a weak but steady hand. Agent Carter, he rasped. I believe we have a mutual interest in surviving the next few hours. Naomi's grip tightened on her weapon. Start talking. Vivian Caldwell's smug expression wavered for the first time as Henry Lawson met her gaze. I'm surprised they haven't found you yet, she said, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice. The bounty on your head is quite substantial. Henry barely reacted. They're too busy dealing with the evidence I've been gathering for the past 6 months. Vivian's smirk disappeared entirely. You're bluffing. Henry shook his head, his breathing still labored, but his resolve unwavering. The flight manifest wasn't a coincidence, Vivian. I wanted to be on that plane with Douglas. I wanted him to see me. To panic. To make exactly the calls he made. Every word has been recorded by the devices I planted in his office 3 months ago. Naomi studied Henry carefully. If you have evidence, why not go directly to the FBI? Henry let out a bitter laugh. After discovering how deeply they've infiltrated your agency? No, Agent Carter, the only way to dismantle the Crescent Group is to force them into the light. Complete public exposure. He checked his watch. I have dead man's switches in place. If I don't enter the cancellation codes within 4 hours, everything, every document, every recording, goes live to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country. Vivian strained against her restraints, her composure cracking. You fool, she spat. Do you have any idea what will happen when that information gets out? How many innocent people will suffer? Henry's eyes hardened. More than the children your organization has trafficked, he shot back. More than the communities destroyed by your pharmaceutical fraud? I don't think so. A sudden pounding on the door shattered the tense silence. Airport security, open up. Naomi motioned for silence, gesturing for Zane and Henry to move behind a large tool cabinet. She positioned herself beside the door, gun raised. A mechanical beep sounded as an electronic key was inserted. Naomi had seconds to decide. If these were real security officers, she couldn't risk injuring them. But if they were Crescent Group operatives, hesitation could be deadly. The door swung open slowly. A familiar face appeared, blood staining his uniform. Vega. The same airport security officer who had helped her earlier. Agent Carter, are you in here? He gasped. Naomi kept her gun trained on him. What happened? Vega stumbled forward, gripping his side. They're right behind me. His breathing was labored, his uniform soaked in blood. The fake FBI. They've taken over the security system. They're tracking you through the cameras. Naomi's heart pounded. How did you find us? Vega gave a weak smile. Followed the blind spots in the security feed. Figured that's what you'd be doing. He caught sight of Henry and Zane. Who are they? Before Naomi could answer, a burst of automatic fire splintered the door frame. Naomi dragged Vivian behind a workbench as Vega returned fire, his sidearm shaking slightly from blood loss. Is there another way out? Naomi shouted over the gunfire. Vega nodded sharply. Maintenance shaft, behind the parts rack, leads to the underground utility tunnels. Zane was already helping Henry toward the hidden exit, prying open a small access panel near the floor. Naomi laid down covering fire, then turned to Vivian. You're coming with us. Vivian laughed mockingly. I'll take my chances here. Naomi's eyes flashed dangerously. That wasn't a request. She grabbed Vivian's arm, yanking her toward the opening. Vega, let's go. The security officer backed toward them, still firing at their attackers. Naomi could see the determination in his eyes. You first, he said. I'll hold them off. Naomi shook her head fiercely. We go together. Vega gritted his teeth. Someone has to slow them down. Get the evidence out, Agent Carter. Make these bastards pay. Naomi hesitated. What's your first name? She asked. For the first time, Vega looked surprised by the question. Damien. Naomi nodded once. Thank you, Damien Vega. I'll make sure people know what you did today. With a final nod, Vega turned back to the door, emptying his magazine in a sustained barrage to give them the precious seconds they needed to escape. Naomi shoved Vivian into the shaft, following close behind. As the access panel slid shut behind them, the last thing Naomi heard was Vega's final stand. A shouted defiance. Then, the sharp, unmistakable crack of gunfire. And then, silence. The maintenance shaft was barely large enough to crawl through. Pitch black except for the faint glow of Zane's phone, the four of them moved quickly, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers. Naomi called ahead softly. Henry, your evidence, what exactly does it contain? His voice came, strained but firm. Everything. Naomi's pulse quickened. Details. Financial records, communications, blackmail material they've used to control officials, names, dates, locations. A pause, including Deputy Director Briggs. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, the weight of the betrayal settling on her shoulders. She forced herself to stay focused. We need to get above ground, she said. Find a way to secure that evidence before the deadline. Zane checked his phone. The nearest exit leads to the airport Marriott. We could blend in with the guests. Regroup. Henry shook his head sharply. They'll have people watching the hotels. His gaze shifted to Vivian. And she'll alert them the first chance she gets. Naomi exhaled slowly, gripping her weapon. Then we split up. Naomi took a breath, knowing there was only one way forward. We split up, she decided. She turned to Zane. Take Henry through the hotel exit. Get him somewhere safe, somewhere he can access his dead man's switches if necessary. Zane hesitated. What about you? Naomi's grip tightened on Vivian's arm. I'm taking her a different way. She's my insurance policy. Henry's eyes darkened. They won't care about her life. Naomi nodded. I'm counting on that. Understanding flashed across Henry's face. You're gonna draw them out. Naomi gave a tight smile. And while they're focused on me, you two get the evidence secured. If I don't make it, we'll make sure it reaches the right people, Zane promised. They reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 directions, one path leading toward the airport hotel, another toward Terminal D, and the last toward the parking structure. Naomi turned to them. Good luck. Zane hesitated for just a second. And Naomi, I'm sorry about what happened on the plane with Vivian. She gave him a faint smirk. Don't be. It reminded me why this work matters. Then, without another word, they disappeared into the hotel tunnel. Naomi turned to Vivian. Parking structure. Let's go. You're making a mistake. Vivian's voice was steady as they moved through the dimly lit corridor, her heels clicking softly against the concrete. Even if Henry's evidence goes public, the Crescent group has contingencies. People will die. Naomi's jaw clenched. People are already dying. Children are being trafficked. Communities are being poisoned. If exposing this costs me my life or my career, so be it. They reached a heavy steel door, the final barrier before the airport's massive parking structure. Naomi checked her weapon, 4 rounds left plus 1 in the chamber. Not much, considering what was likely waiting for them. She exhaled. Ready? Vivian gave a mocking smile. For what? To be used as a human shield? To die for your misguided heroics? Naomi pushed open the door. The parking garage was eerily quiet. Rows of parked vehicles gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights. Naomi moved cautiously, keeping Vivian close, scanning the shadows for threats. They made it to the 2nd level before she spotted them. 2 men in suits by the elevator, another pair near the stairwell. The trap was set. Vivian didn't even try to feign surprise. They're here. Naomi's grip tightened on her arm. You can still walk away, Vivian murmured. Tell them you've realized the scale of what you're up against. They might let you live. Naomi smirked coldly. I didn't join the bureau to look the other way. She steered Vivian toward a row of parked cars, keeping low. If she could reach the far stairwell, she might be able to double back into the terminal. But then, a voice called out. Special Agent Carter, that's far enough. Naomi turned slowly. Nah. Standing 20 feet away, flanked by 4 armed men, was Deputy Director Samuel Briggs, the same man who had mentored her at Quantico. The same man who had shaped her career. Now he looked at her with cold calculation. Hello, Naomi, he said smoothly, keeping his hands casually at his sides. Naomi kept her weapon trained on Vivian. Fancy meeting you here, sir. Briggs sighed. You've caused quite a stir this morning. Naomi's eyes never left his. I wasn't planning to go quietly. Briggs tilted his head slightly, as if disappointed but not surprised. Always the idealist. That's what made you such an excellent agent. He gestured to his men. Please release Miss Caldwell. This doesn't need to end violently. Naomi let out a quiet laugh. Oh, I think it does. She kept her gun raised. Because I'm not surrendering, and I'm guessing you're not walking away. Briggs exhaled through his nose, as if dealing with a stubborn child. You're outnumbered and outgunned, Naomi. He shook his head. And Henry Lawson's evidence will never see the light of day. We're already tracking him and your NSA friend through the hotel. Naomi felt a cold chill crawl up her spine, but her expression remained neutral. You seem very confident. Briggs smirked. We've been doing this a long time, longer than you've been alive. He took a step closer. The Crescent Group exists because it fulfills a need. It creates order in a chaotic world. Sometimes, that requires difficult choices. Naomi's hands curled into fists. Selling children isn't a difficult choice, she spat. It's a crime against humanity. Briggs shook his head, almost amused. That was Morales' operation, not ours. We merely provided the infrastructure, the protection. The products moved through our networks are determined by market demands, not moral judgments. Naomi's stomach twisted. Is that how you sleep at night? By pretending you're not responsible? Briggs gave a small shrug. I don't need to justify it. I understand it. The world isn't the idealistic place they taught you about at Quantico. Real power operates in the shadows. Always has. Always will. Naomi's mind was calculating distances, angles, possibilities. 5 armed men. Likely more in the area. 5 bullets left. Not good odds. But she hadn't survived 15 years in the field without learning a few tricks. She lowered her weapon slightly, her shoulders relaxing. You know what, Briggs? You might be right. His expression relaxed fractionally. The opening she needed. In one fluid motion, Naomi shoved Vivian toward him, dropped to one knee, and fired 2 rapid shots. The first round caught one of Briggs's men in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. The second shattered the overhead lighting, plunging half the garage into darkness. Chaos erupted. Briggs's men opened fire, bullets ripping into cars and concrete. Naomi rolled behind an SUV, gripping her weapon. The fight wasn't over yet. Naomi counted to 3, then darted from behind the SUV, firing another shot to keep Briggs's men pinned down. 3 bullets left. She kept moving through the maze of parked cars, using them as cover, forcing Briggs's men to reposition. Behind her, Briggs's voice barked out orders, directing his men to flank her position. She had 30 seconds, maybe less, before they had her boxed in. Then, the sound of sirens. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. One of Briggs's men shouted in alarm. "Sir, we've got incoming! Local PD multi-units!" For the first time, Briggs hesitated, caught between pursuing her and avoiding a full-on confrontation with law enforcement. Naomi didn't wait for him to decide. She sprinted for the stairwell, firing her last rounds to cover her retreat. A bullet grazed her arm, another whizzed past her ear, but adrenaline carried her through the exit and into the stairwell. Down she went, 3 steps at a time, heart pounding, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant as police sirens wailed closer. At ground level, she burst through the exit, stepping into the morning sunlight. Without breaking stride, she merged into the crowd of travelers, lowering her head, moving with the flow of people toward the terminal. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the message. Evidence secured. Switches deactivated. Meeting location changed to 3rd option. A small smile flickered across her face. Henry and Zane had done it. The evidence was safe. Now, she just had to reach them, without being captured or killed first. Inside the terminal, Naomi spotted Briggs and 2 of his men pushing through security, their badges out, eyes scanning the crowd. Time for a change of plans. She ducked into a restroom, quickly removing her hoodie, pulling her hair free from its ponytail, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. From her pocket, she retrieved a pair of reading glasses, a subtle but effective disguise. Different enough to avoid immediate recognition, casual enough to blend in. Back in the concourse, she moved with purpose, making her way toward the NOLA transit station. If she could reach downtown, she knew of safe houses even Briggs wouldn't know about. But then, a TV screen caught her attention. Breaking news. She stopped in her tracks, stepping into a small airport bar, eyes locked on the screen. Explosion at Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport parking structure. Multiple casualties reported. Footage showed the parking garage where she had confronted Briggs, now engulfed in flames. A cleanup operation. Eliminating evidence. Eliminating witnesses. Her stomach twisted. Had Briggs been caught in his own trap? Or had he orchestrated it from a safe distance? Her phone buzzed again. Turn on CNN. Now, Naomi turned back to the screen, her breath catching as the news broadcasts switched to another breaking story. Major human trafficking network exposed, federal officials implicated. A wave of chills ran through her. Henry had released the evidence. Maybe as insurance, maybe as a final blow after the explosion. Documents flashed across the screen. Financial transactions, intercepted communications, photographs of officials with known criminals. And then, the face of Samuel Briggs prominently displayed alongside members of the Crescent group. The bartender turned up the volume. An anonymous source has provided multiple news organizations with evidence of a vast criminal network operating throughout the Southeast. The documents implicate numerous federal officials, corporate executives, and state-level politicians in what appears to be one of the largest corruption scandals in recent history. Around her, travelers stopped in their tracks, their eyes glued to the screen. Naomi glanced around. Several law enforcement officers were also watching, their expressions shifting from shock to grim understanding. Her phone buzzed again. Exit plan activated. Proceed to secondary extraction point. Naomi slipped out of the bar, a mix of victory and grief washing over her. People like Vega had died to bring this truth to light. Her career was likely over, even if she was ultimately vindicated. The Bureau didn't look kindly on agents who exposed corruption in the ranks. But children would be saved. Trafficking routes would be disrupted. Light had finally been shined into the darkest corners of power. As she stepped onto the NOLA transit train, she touched the gold band on her finger, her grandmother's ring. A reminder of where she came from. A line of strong women who had survived much worse than anything the world could throw at them. The truth was out. And whatever came next, she was ready. Back in the terminal, Zane watched her departure from a distance, a burner phone in his hand. His role was done, for now. Henry Lawson was already on a private flight to a secure location, and the evidence was spreading across the internet faster than the Crescent group could possibly contain it. Vivian Caldwell, caught in the parking structure explosion, would never stand trial for her crimes. Neither would several of Briggs's men. But Briggs himself had survived, and now he was the subject of a nationwide manhunt. As the train departed carrying Naomi toward an uncertain future, Zane sent one final text. The journey for justice never ends, only continues. Until our paths cross again, Agent Carter. Miles away, as his plane lifted into the clouds, Henry Lawson read the message on his device and smiled. Phase 1 was complete. The Crescent group was exposed, its operations were crippled. But there were other groups, other networks. The fight against trafficking and corruption wasn't over. And now, Naomi Carter was a crucial piece on the board. The real game was just beginning. The end. Top of form, bottom of form.